So if no voting system is going to be fair in all situations, what do people do? Well, what what elections and organizations and also states and countries and counties, anyone holding election does is they try to do their best. They pick what they think would be the fairest or the best method for them to pick a winner in an election, and they choose that method ahead of time, and then they stick with that method. Um, but what a lot of people have said is that maybe there are subtle differences where some voting methods are going to be more fair in more situations. So everyone kind of has an opinion, and there's lots of studies related to that. But one thing that has been suggested is that since nothing can be absolutely fair, what we might do instead of thinking about voting for single candidates all the time is think about trying to make the most people in the most situations happy, or at least make the least people unhappy. And one way that has been proposed to do that for elections is called approval voting. In approval voting, instead of voting for a particular candidate or ranking the candidates, a voter marks whether they approve of each candidate. And here's the interesting thing, voters may approve of more than one candidate. So let's see how this might work. Suppose there are three candidates in an election. On the ballots, voters give their first choice, and then they mark which candidates they approve of. Now, one thing to note, um, a voter is going to approve of their first choice. It's their first choice is considered approval, but what they're allowed to do is mark other candidates that they also approve of, that they'd be okay if that person won the election. So let's look at the results here. 30% of the voters in the election wanted A as their first choice, but they were also just fine or approved of B. If B won, they'd be fine with that. 29% want B as their first choice, but they would also approve of A. 1% would choose A as their first choice, but do not approve of either B or C. So 1% say A and A only. And then 40% say they want C as their first choice and do not approve of either A or B. So they approve of neither A nor B. So again, those 40% are saying C and C alone. Well, if we were doing this election with just first choice votes, so pretty much kind of like looking at plurality, who would be the winner? So if we only looking at first choice votes, that would mean we're only looking at this first part of these statements. So we'd be looking at counting up first choice votes for A, B, and C. Well, starting with A, 30% want A as their first choice in that first bullet. 29% want B as their first choice. Then we have 1% who also wants A, so I'll add 1% to A's votes. And then C, 40% wanted C. If I total that up, that's 31% for A, 29% for B, and 40% for C. And as you can see, with plurality, C would win. C has the most first choice votes. But if we think about that, only 40% of people wanted C to win. If we look back at the approval, none of the candidates who voted for A or B approve of C. None of the candidates who voted for A or B as their first choice liked C. So even though C wins, 60% of voters did not approve of C. So what you have here is a lot of people unhappy. A lot of people unhappy. So you've got 40% of people who are just cheering like crazy, and 60% are very unhappy because they do not approve of C. So, but this would be using just simply one vote for each person and only looking at first choice votes. We would have C as the winner. But a lot of people are unhappy. Well, what if we used approval voting instead? Now, approval voting says we're going to look at not just their first choice, but anyone you approve of as well. So we recalculate these votes. And again, first choice is considered approval. So I would still keep 31% for A, 29% for B, and 40% for C, but I want to add in approval next. Okay, so let's go to the other part of the bullets, which is the approval part. So in the first bullet, even 30% of people voted for A as their first choice, but they also are okay with B. So technically, 30% can get added to B because those 30% are fine with B. They approve of B. And the next bullet, we have 29% of people voting for B as their first choice, but those 29% also approve of A. So we can add 29% to A's votes. If we look down further in the approval part of the bullets, the 1% and the 40% that are left who voted for A and C as their first choice, they didn't approve of either of the other two candidates. So C gets no further approval votes. So when we do the tallies now with approval added in, A gets 60% of the votes, B gets 59% of the votes, and C gets 40%. So with approval, A wins because A has the most approval. And 60% of the voters would be happy with that decision. And the only people who would technically be unhappy are the people who voted for C. So you'd have 40% of the voters would be unhappy, but you would have a majority of voters, 60%, would be happy. They would be satisfied with A winning. So approval is one way to kind of look at voting differently. Instead of thinking about each person having one vote for a single candidate, you can vote for multiple candidates instead of approval so that you then calculate and maybe get the candidate winning who has the most approval and therefore make the most people happy, in other words, the least people unhappy. One last comment on this method. When you allow for approval voting, you are allowing for people to vote for more than one candidate. So the total of your percentages at the end will be more than 100% or maybe more than 100%. Whereas when you look at first choice votes, your total percentages will add up to 100%. You're only looking at 100% of the votes because everyone gets a single vote with first choice voting. Whereas with approval voting, everybody can vote for more than one person, so you may have a higher percent than 100%. So approval voting is kind of an alternative, and it gives us our sixth method for finding the winner of election.